Hello, everybody. My name is Sharon Thesen, and I'd like to invite you to an online reading I'll be doing on January the 20th at 11 a.m. for the SICA Poems for Peace initiative. I'm a Canadian born in Saskatchewan and a Cascadian long residing in British Columbia, currently in the southern interior traditional lands of the Silex people. I'm a poet, editor, critic, teacher in various capacities, and a retired university professor. I'm currently part of a writing group hosted by the Cascadia Poetics Lab, and I'm really honored to have been asked by Paul Nelson, who convened that particular writing group, to participate in this SICA Poems for Peace reading series. It's difficult for me to articulate why I think poetry and peace are aligned or even intertwined in the sense in which self and other, the interior world, the exterior world, can come together in poetry in a way that is just not possible in any other form of discourse form or art form. I, at the same time, struggle myself a little bit with the notion of peace in or inhabiting poetry, a certain kind of poetry that wants peace to be the result of it. And by peace, I think we shouldn't mean really a sort of, just sort of a pleasant stasis of everybody getting along, but rather the peace that is gained by the particular interaction of language, words, ideas, image, and rhythm in a poem. And I think that particular kind of chaos or controlled chaos that a poem is what Shelley was talking about when he said that a poem or poetry lifts the veil from the beauty of the world. And I think that's a really, I think that's a really valid way to think of peace as the beauty of the world composed of its particularities, even suffering, even despair, even strife are modes of being and have their images and activities in language, and therefore can come into poetry. And still in the way that the poem is showing us those images as it goes along, can leave us with the sense of being alive, of being restored to aliveness. And for me, peace is aliveness, the complexity of aliveness. And it's not simply a sort of quietude. There are some other people who've said things about poetry that I think are really relevant to the idea of poetry and peace. Jane Hirschfield, for example, says, even in poems that seem to risk the didactic, the buoyant face of the particular counterbalances certitude's arrogance and leaden pull. And so Hirschfield again quotes a poem. This is a poem from 1,000 years ago that I think is really exemplary of the phenomenon of poetry and peace. This poem says, by Izumi Shikibu, "It is true, the wind blows terribly here, but moonlight also leaks between the roof planks of this ruined house. My thought was that poetry leaks through the roof planks of the ruined house of the present. I do think of poetry as a kind of necessary and universal medicine for the human spirit. I don't know about you, but when I'm in the presence of good poetry, I feel restored to humility, wholeness, aliveness, respect, and awe, which is what I understand peace to be. So I'm going to read a couple of poems to introduce you to my work and give you a sense of what I'm going to be reading on the 20th. I'm going to read a shorter poem called The Gold Cure, which is about a tuberculosis cure. It was a cure for a while, but it turned out to be toxic, so it was abandoned. Back in the 1930s, my own stepfather underwent the gold cure at one of those Swiss sanatoriums that Thomas Mann wrote about in The Magic Mountain. And so I'll read that, and I'm going to read a couple of poems about circus performers after that. So this one, The Gold Cure. Limpid, decadent warmth in Davos in the summertime, where consumptives once lightly fried on the verandas of the Berghof Schatzalp. The magic mountain of Thomas Mann's imagination, and lived in dreams and numerologies, where time was not time, but a thing. And to be there was to be a character in an opera or a ballet in which a patient might take the role of a faun in Afternoon of a Faun. A patient who'd only come to visit someone. He forgets who now, but here he is himself instead. Such is the swiftness and efficiency of contagion in this trapped condition on the mountaintop, where patients must eventually fall in love with each other or the doctor, as we do in prisons, warehouses, spaceships, schools, convents, labs, offices, outposts, boats, due to proximity and a quasi-domestic dailiness, and which must be forbidden or managed, or not managed at all, through the boredom of the rest cure, or the throes of the toxic side effects of the gold cure, because gold's atoms are tightly linked, and it is difficult to force them past each other. So that's from my book called The Receiver. And on the 20th, I'll be reading a longer poem about when my mother was in a TB sanatorium near Kamloops, BC, called Tranquille. And another kind of poetic preoccupation of mine is circus performers. And I might be reading from a longer poem in another book about some circus performers. But this is one that I wrote for the Cascadia Tertulia writing group that Paul Nelson convened, that I'm part of. And I wrote this one for one of last year's meetings. And it's about there are four Ringling Brothers circus performers. The first two, Pinito del Oro and the Great Unus, were discovered by John North, who was with the Ringling Brothers and went to Europe just after the war to tour all of the little roadside circuses, small town circuses, to find really talented people. And he did come back with these two, Pinito and Unus. 1. Pinito del Oro performer on the single trapeze. Slipped off her shoes and mounted a rope ladder, being held down tight by 2 men in suits. Ascended the ladder like a kid, up into the spotlit darkness at the top of the big top tent. Climbed onto the trapeze, no net below, getting going with long swings back and forth, clutching the bar with her toes, weaving side to side, corner to corner, back to front, then on her knees, then on just one knee, and then standing on her head on the metal bar, legs splayed out for balance, she pretends to read the morning paper. For a while, the audience frozen. The rope ladder is pulled down and down she climbs, puts her shoes back on, her satin cape of wings. She had 3 nearly fatal falls, skull fractures, broken hands, surgery to raise her toes back up after so much clutching the bar. Pinito del Oro, little pine of gold, signed her contract in a gypsy cage on the outskirts of Murcia, Spain, with its hidden waterfalls and fanciful cathedral. Number 2, the great Unus who stood on one finger. John North made all the selections, traveling around Europe, hiring 20 acts for the Ringling Brothers, among them Pinito del Oro and Unus, who stood on one finger, discovered in a Barcelona nightclub. The great Unus wore white gloves when performing, but before his finale would remove the gloves and show his bare hands, then put the gloves back on and climb to the top of a giant electric light bulb. And on top of that bulb would balance on his index finger with his feet straight up in the air. Ernest Hemingway wrote, "In your dreams, you watch Unus standing on one finger and you think, look at such a fine, intelligent, and excellent man making his living standing on one finger, when most of us cannot even stand on our own 2 feet." Okay, number 3, Lou Jacobs, Clown Auguste, gave up the white face and the Perot suit he had worn as a contortionist for a red satin dress carrying a bird cage with an old shoe in it that sang like a canary. He was a mother with a baby in the burning house gag, the tall driver wearing huge shoes in the midget car gag. A tiny sedan backfires into the center ring and pulls into the gas station, run by the Italian dwarf clown Frankie Saluto. Saluto tells Jacobs to park the car closer to the gas pump. Jacobs whacks Saluto over the head with a mallet, raising a balloon-sized welt. The car keeps on backfiring. Jacobs unscrews the radiator cap and a snake and a geyser of water gush out. He sits on the water to try to stop it, but it spouts out the top of his head. With his hand, he tries to stop it, but the torrent pours from his mouth. He and Saluto push the car closer to the pump. Saluto climbs into it, and Jacobs tosses in a bomb. The explosion sends a Saluto-sized dummy to the top of the tent, which floats back down in a parachute. Number 4, Emmett Kelly, Old Tired Clown. "By laughing at me, they laugh at themselves," said Emmett Kelly, sweeping up a moving spotlight on the floor with a broom. "It gives them," he said, "a sort of spiritual second wind. I feel the same way about poetry." The circle of light Emmett Kelly sweeps up grows smaller and smaller. When only a flicker is left, Kelly reaches into his overcoat and produces a dustpan into which he sweeps this tiny residue of light. So join me on January 20th at 11 a.m. For a reading, a poetry reading that I'll be doing for SICA Poems for Peace. Thanks.